We are Tibetans.
Our country, Tibet, was invaded by China in 1950.
For over 70 years, China has run roughshod over the rights of the Tibetan people, our people.
Our land has been stolen, our lives systematically eradicated.
Before the occupation, Tibetans stewarded the land with care and concern, preserving the pastures, rivers, and mountains.
But today, under China's military occupation, Tibet and its unique and important environment are suffering the consequences of failed policies, greed, and exploitation.
Gigantic unregulated mines tear through Tibet's landscape.
Mega hydropower stations choke major Tibetan rivers, vital rivers that supply fresh water to over 1 billion people.
Our villages flooded, our cultural heritage destroyed, and all without any consultation with local Tibetans.
China's exploitation of Tibet is causing mass pollution, destroying vital ecosystems, and defacing Tibet's once pristine landscape.
Our land,
our life,
our livelihoods
are being destroyed.
And international companies are complicit in the exploitation and destruction of Tibet.
now we are taking a stand.
We Tibetans from around the world are calling for a global moratorium on resource extraction and mega development in Tibet.
Until Tibetans are able to determine how our land and resources are used, all extraction of Tibet's natural resources must halt.
Those who profit from Tibet's resource exploitation are complicit in the occupation and repression of the Tibetan people, as well as the destruction of our lands.
We call on international companies
and international governments
to listen to our words and support our cause.
Tashidale. Hi everyone, I'm Rashi Chori. I'm the lead campaigns coordinator of International Tibet Network. We're a coalition of over 130 Tibetan organizations campaigning for an end to human rights violations in Tibet and restoring the rights of Tibetan people. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's very critical conversation about Tibet's future. This panel is one of the first that we would be hosting about this very important issue. For decades now, the Tibetan people have been facing a devastating struggle to protect their unique culture, lands, and natural resources from destructive mega development projects by China. Despite having invaluable knowledge and skills about the third pole, Tibetans are being denied a seat at the table. Joining us today to explore this critical issue is an esteemed panel of experts who have dedicated their work to understanding the complexities for Tibet's struggle for environmental and cultural preservation. To begin with, I would like to welcome our first guest, Dr. Lobsang Yangso. She serves as the Program and Environment Coordinator of International Tibet Network in India. Her research focuses on climate change in Tibet and the Himalayan region and water security. She is a strong advocate and campaigner for the rights of local and indigenous people, particularly Tibetans, actively advocating for their inclusion in climate policy making. I would also like to welcome our second expert, Dempa Gelson La. He is the Deputy Director at Tibet Policy Institute, and his research focuses on the socio-environmental impact of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. He has written on a number of environmental issues, including the increasing cases of natural disaster and garbage littering. And he is the member of International Association for Tibetan Studies and Association for Nepal Himalayan Studies. He has attended 5 UN climate change summits and presented papers at various universities across India and outside. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to start with Lobsang, if you could speak a little bit about why we're here today. It's the 6-month anniversary of the Dege protest. And it's an issue that has been widely talked about. But could you talk a little bit about the Dege protest and what really led up to it?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Rashi. Hi, everyone. Tashi Dilek. So before we talk about Dege protest, what happened in Dege is something which is not isolate or it's not unique, because the Chinese policies that we see in Tibet, there would be many more Dege protest, kind of Dege protest happening, and will happen in Tibet. So before we go on Dege protest, I think it's also important for us to understand the Chinese government's infrastructure development policies, and also Xi Jinping's continued drive towards achieving a carbon neutral economy and also high rate of urbanization. These are the policies that also leads to lots of policies inside Tibet, such as the Khamdok Dam construction. So Khamdok Dam construction is the leading reservoir for the western route to the south-north water diversion project to divert water from the Yangtze to the Yellow River. And so also Khamdok Dam is one of the series of 13 power station, plant on the Dichu River, which is also known as Jinsha River. So, it is being developed by Hangdong Jinsha River Upper Reaches Hydropower Development, and right now it's managed by the China Hangdong Group. So on this year, on February 14th of this year, hundreds of Tibetan men, women, monks from Dege, they have peacefully protested at the Chinese government's, local official office, and regarding the Khamdok dam, and asking to stop the dam construction, and then also to reconsider their decision. However, their legitimate demands have been, as we all know, have been met with violence, detention and assault, and which also reflects the continued suppression of Tibetan voices, and then also the reality of Beijing's colonial policies in Tibet. And so, since the when we talk about the Khamdok Dam, it's also important to understand the significance of Dege, the local historical significance of Dege as well. Dege, it had its own kingdom, and also very rich in culture and arts. And Dege is also very famous of its landmark, Dege printing press, which has been built in 18th century, and it's also one of the place where it draws lots of tourists over here. But with this Khamtok Dam, it will impact not only in Dege but also Jomda County in Chamdo as well, and then two villages and 6 monasteries would be submerged if this dam is built. Thank you. Rashi, you are on a mute.
Sorry, I think it's just one of those things. No, but thank you so much for sharing that, because we've all seen the images that have come out of Deke, we've seen the videos that have come out. And it's just a testament to Tibetan resilience of how hard Tibetans work to protect their land and their culture. I'd like to come to you, Tempala, as you're the environmental expert. Can you elaborate on the potential impact of the Kamtok Dam and just overall mega development in occupied Tibet?
Thank you very much, Rashi. Yes, the Kamtu Dam has significant negative implication on the environment in Tibet for sure. And one easiest example that we can understand is that a large swath of land would be submerged because of the Kamtu Dam and the reservoirs that would be built in that area. And this particular area is highly fertile, very fertile. So which means a large part of fertile field would also be submerged. And it's also an area with a very dense forest coverage. So which means also a large area of forested land would be submerged. And most importantly, the people in the region who have nurtured and protected the land and the surrounding areas, who had a history of thousands of years of history with the land and the river itself, as they would be displaced, the people that the absence of people in that region would lose would lose the nurturing impact on that particular land. So the environment implication is, I would say, in the future there would be increased landslide for sure as the river uh, fill up and it would move backward as it fill up, and that means there would be more and more submerge of the area, and that would cause landslide for sure. And it could also possibly cause a very, very risky flood in the future. We have seen collapse of mega dams across the globe, particularly in recent years, and which means in the future the Tibetans who live along the bank of the Dichu River, and also millions of Chinese who live along the bank of the Dichu River could be at a very, very risky position because look at this. Tibet has seen increased precipitation, increased rainfall in the last 6 or 7 years, particularly since 2015. Which means there would be more and more the possibility of accumulation of more water into those reservoirs and those dams, and that would put immense risk on the dam. And that's one possible risk. Now, other implication is the loss of large plot of land under those reservoirs would means loss of some species, some distinct forests or plants in those regions, and also would disturb the habitation of some very important wildlife in those areas.
Thank you, Tempala. It's genuinely like one of those things that kind of, I mean, we know historically like China has gone ahead and done really horrible things in Tibet, but with this particular dam, there have been reports that about 4,000 Tibetans would be displaced, about 6 monasteries are at threat, they would be submerged, and we're looking at 500-year-old history just being destroyed like that. Um, and you also spoke a lot about the wildlife. So, what are the other consequences that we're looking at should Kamtok Dam go ahead? Because this dam, and I'd like to let people also know, is that it's it's in the process. It's not made. Like we're still working on it. So, what are the consequences of a dam like this to go ahead?
The Kamtu Dam should absolutely not go ahead. So if we are independent state, if we have the right over our land as a government, we would definitely not won't build such a dam that would displace people and destroy land. But China, as a colonial power in Tibet, this is a colonial behavior for sure. So for the Chinese, it's all about themselves, as the Dr. Lafayette said, to achieve their energy goals. So for them, Tibet is just a playground where they could benefit the maximum at the cost of Tibetan people's life, history, way of life, and of course the ecology itself. As we all know, Tibet has a very fragile ecosystem that requires immense care and nurturing. And we Tibetans, having lived there for thousands of years, have mastered a craft of nurturing the land, the Tibetan Plateau, despite being very harsh, very fragile. We have not only survived, but we have flourished. We have built up a powerful empire in the 7th century, and now we have become a powerful civilization with immense power. Now, with the displacement of 4,000 people and destruction of so many monasteries, we are losing history of that particular land. We are losing the connection between land and people. And imagine 4,000 people and dozens of villages and monasteries be forced to move away from a place that they have lived for generations. And not only moved away, but moved away in a different, scattered into different directions. Can you imagine? Only a colonial power will do that because there has been no consultation with people. So that's what I'm saying. It's a colonial behavior with no sense of care for the Tibetan people, and the building of the Kamtu Dam not only risks life of Tibetan people, but it will have immense risk on the millions of Chinese who live on the banks of Dichu River, which is called Yangtze in China, because it's one of the banks where most of the Chinese in the southern regions, southwestern regions, they have livelihood along those banks. And in China, I think it was in 1970 something, where there's the famous Banjo Dam collapse, in which millions of Chinese lost their homes, thousands of Chinese lost their lives. And what the Chinese said, the dam was supposed to survive for thousands years of risk, but unfortunately there was a natural disaster that was impossible to challenge. So, irrespective of Chinese claim that they have mastered engineering or the technological advancement of building dams, they can never predict what is coming in the coming years. And in case of a collapse of the dams in Tibet, it's a cascade of dams. It's not just one dam. There are 11 different dams on that particular river, which means one collapse of one dam could escalate the collapse of another dam, which means the destruction of that collapse would be immense for the Tibetans, and also would be immense for the innocent lives of the Chinese on the bank of that particular river.
Right. I mean, thank you so much, Tempala. That is quite scary to know. For those who are joining us right now, please just feel free to drop questions wherever you're watching it. This is currently streaming live on Facebook and on YouTube. We would be taking questions live, so please, with any of our experts, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the comments. Lobsang, I want to come back to you. Protests on this scale in Tibet are quite rare, and not because of Tibetans not wanting to protest, just because the crackdown by China and just the threat to people's life is so high that it's extremely rare to have protests on such large scale. Can you talk a little bit about the crackdown that Dege protesters faced, and also what the demands of the protesters are?
Thank you, Rashi, for your question. Yes, I mean, it's interesting here because when Tibetans, they have seen lots of protest in Tibet, right? And when Tibetans inside Tibet, when they protest, they know how China will, do crackdown on them. And they understand the risk. They understand that they will be jailed, or they will be arrested, or they will be beaten as well. But the Tibetans inside Tibet, they took that risk of taking videos, going to the Chinese government's officials' offices, and then asking them to stop the dam. But how China respond on these Tibetans, the peaceful protester, how they respond is very pity. Is the, as the Tembala mentioned earlier, is the exact behavior of how scared the colonial power functions, right? When Tibetans, when they protested, they appealed, and they appealed to saying that their demand was very simple. They're saying their demand was to stop the damming, to hold the dam construction. But how the Chinese government cracked down was like, the people were peaceful protesters were arbitrarily detained and also arrested without any due process. The police coming, encircling the monks, and then forcefully dragging them around. And then we also know that on 28th of February, we have seen videos of armed police marching through the streets of Wangpo township, and then arresting the community leaders, and then also imposing curfews on several villages, censoring the mention of Dege Dam protest on social media platforms. during that time, the roads were closed. There was a strict restriction in people movement in one place to another. There were like 5 checkpoints, between Wangbo village and also Dege county as well. And so right now there is no news of whereabout of Wangpo monastery senior administrator and then village leader as well. And then recently, Tibet Watch has also released a report, a news saying that on May 28th, they said that, in Jomda County, 2 villages, which were listed for the relocation were subjected to house checks in March, where there is a door-to-door visit under the campaign of one household and one file, and investigating and watching and interrogating people. It's a kind of system of social control where individuals were divided into group of 10 people, so that these people they monitor each other. So this clearly shows how Chinese government is scared of the bravery of Tibetan people. And for me personally, Chinese government will continue to build more dams on every river that flows from Tibet to other downstream nations. And there will be more protests happening. Tibetans inside Tibet, they will protest more as well. And so in terms of, as your second question, Rashi, you were saying about the demands. As I said earlier, their demands are very simple. So this, one of the, Tibetans who are in exile, who were from Dege, he said that this Dege protest and dam construction is not a one event that started this year. He said that the Chinese has been doing this dam construction, and Chinese government has been doing the mining and the exploitation of natural resources for the past 20 years. So locals were saying that earlier, at night time, the Chinese would do mining so that the locals would not come. And with specific regard to the Khamtok Dam, since 2012, when the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission, which is the government, Chinese government's development agency, when they approved the construction of the Khamtok Dam, the residents from Dege and Jomda, they issued an appeal saying that please don't build this dam and stop the forced relocation. But that time the Chinese authority did deceptively promised that it would not move forward unless there is 80% locals agreed. But then in 2018 there was no evidence that local people have gave the consent. But then the construction they said that they will carry on the construction. And so I mean, their demand is very simple, but what happens in Dege is exact example of what will happen in other places in Tibet as well. And in terms of the demand, in Tibet there is no space for people to express, no space for people to assemble and associate, and there is no free and peer and informed consult and consultation. There was no independent environment impact assessment has been carried out in Dege. So I think right now it's time that people, the international community should come up and raise voice. And specifically, I would also urge the UN Human Rights Councils, the governments, the embassies. There has been a constant push from the Tibet groups and Tibetan communities asking the international community to act, and so we are waiting for them to act. Thank you.
Thanks, Lobsang. It's so clear that there is like absolute evidence that Tibetans in Dege have time and again protested the construction of the Khamtok Dam, and it's not just in Tibet, and kind of also sets me up for our next set of guests. I would really like to thank you and Dembala for being with us today. Repression in Tibet is not just limited to Dege. It is a part in. And to speak more about that, I would like to invite our next guest. Please welcome Ladin Thetong, who is an award-winning activist and leader of the Tibetan freedom movement. She's been organizing and strategizing for Tibet almost all her life. In 2009, she co founded Tibet Action Institute with a vision of combining cutting edge technology with strategic nonviolence to design strategies and carry out innovative programs that advance human rights and freedoms in Tibet. In 2011, Ladin was awarded the first annual James Lawson Award for Nonviolent Achievements by the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, and in 2018, she accepted the Democracy Award from National Endowment for Democracy on behalf of Tibet Action Institute. Ladin is also a personal inspiration to me. She's one of the reasons that I joined the movement in the first place. And so very welcome to Ladin to be here with us. I would also like to invite Dr. Zoe Bedford, who's the Executive Director of Australia Tibet Council. She has been involved with Australia Tibet Council since 1999 when she volunteered at an event. Since that time, she has worked with ATC as a campaigner and has also been on the board as a director and chairperson. Zoe has a Doctor of Social Sciences in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Sydney, as well as a Master's in International Social Development from the University of NSW and a Bachelor of Arts honors from Newcastle University. Hi, Zoe. I'd also like I'd also like to invite our third guest in this segment, Tenzin Pasang, who's the National Director of SFT India. Pasang was born as a stateless refugee in India, where she then went to complete her master's degree in sociology from Jawaharlal Nehru University. In 2020, Pasang interned at SFT India, where she helped coordinate 3 projects, including a solidarity initiative with the global campaign to save 12 Hong Kong youths, an initiative to stand in solidarity with activists arrested under the national security law. Since joining the SFT India team as the program director in 2021, Pasang has successfully organized key programs such as the Free Tibet Action Camp in 2022 and Little Lhasa program in 2022-2023, all while overcoming and winning a tremendous battle with cancer. Hi, Pasang. Thank you so much for all 3 of you for being here today. A lot of what Lobsang spoke about before really talks about the courage of Tibetans who are risking just about everything to protect their land, to protect their culture and way of life. Ladin, you and I spoke very briefly in February when this was happening about the giants in the movement, where we were sort of speaking about how people who have come before us and how people who are with us right now are the ones who are setting the path for how the Tibetan movement is seen. And this is just not happening in Dege. It's a pattern that's happening all over Tibet. Can you speak a little bit about the repressions that Tibetans in Tibet are facing and how they're challenging it?
Yeah, thanks, Rashi. And it's great to be here with all of you. And it's an honor to speak on the anniversary, the 6 months, 6 short months since the people of Dege rose up and really risked everything to say no to this destruction of their homes and their livelihoods and their history and their displacement, their forced removal from their ancient, their ancestral lands. So I think fundamentally we look to the people as the inspiration, as we always have, like you said, Rashi, in Tibet. And people inside Tibet have been resisting, it's not just China's military occupation of Tibet, so taking over the land and taking civil political rights away from Tibetans, but it's the forced removal of Tibetans, like Tibetan nomads. China intends to take all Tibetan nomads, which actually the vast majority of Tibetans are nomadic or semi-nomadic people. So the Chinese government has been steadily under the, guise of development or environmental protection, forcibly resettling and moving Tibetan nomads, farmers, Tibetan people off their ancestral lands and into essentially, what looks like modern housing projects, but really are just like the worst kind of isolated, under-resourced, and totally under their control, reservation style neighborhoods or so-called communities. And so you've got the situation in Tibet where the key to Tibetan livelihood and history and environmental sort of conservation stewardship of the land, the way of life people have known for centuries. Tibetans are forced out of that life in the name of development and environmental protection. And at the same time, the other sort of pillar of Tibetan identity and the pillar of Tibet and what Tibet is, who Tibetans are, is sort of language and cultural identity. And that also is under attack. Tibetan children now, probably upwards of 80%, in the end, of all Tibetan students or children really between the ages of 4 to 18 are now living in residential boarding schools or a system of colonial boarding schools run by the Chinese state, where they're being essentially their traditional identities being wiped out, and they're China's trying to turn them into like Chinese nationalists, where they speak Chinese or Mandarin, not Tibetan, and where they don't know their traditional life and way and customs because and religion, Buddhism or whatever, there are Tibetan Muslims as well. So they are essentially being, they're trying to wipe out this entire next generation. They're trying to wipe out their Tibetanness and trying to turn them into Chinese. And this is against the will of Tibetan parents, obviously, and of Tibetans at large. And so then I would say the final pillar that's under attack in Tibet is also the Tibetan Buddhism. So when people think of Tibet, they think of Tibetan Buddhists. They think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Tibetan monks and monasteries, and that's because the vast majority of Tibetans are Buddhist practitioners, and in this way, that faith and that spiritual strength for the vast majority of Tibetans that comes from this religion, spiritual tradition that has been marked for elimination by the Chinese authorities. And under Xi Jinping, all of the repression we've seen in the past is ramped up in a way that they have targeted the monasteries. So they're trying to empty the monasteries. They don't let young people enter the monasteries anymore. These kids are supposed to, instead of having a education in the monastery from a young age, they can't join until they're 18 or older. And at the same time, the leadership, the transmission of teachings, and the importance of the teacher, the Lama, and the tulku, the reincarnation, the tradition where the teachings are passed from senior practitioners to the next generations and to the people, that's all being upended. And the Chinese government is trying to strictly control the process of reincarnation, even though that doesn't make any sense, and trying to undermine and hollow out Buddhism and the Tibetan Buddhist system while leaving it kind of intact superficially. So you can go to Tibet and people will see monasteries and they'll see monks, and it seems like they're doing their religious practice, but actually it's all strictly being controlled while they hollow it out from the inside. And that's, that goes for every aspect of this sort of attack on Tibetan identity. China wants to eliminate
Tibetanness, Tibetan religion, language, culture, what it is to be Tibetan, even in our future generations, all of them, in order to eliminate resistance to Chinese rule. Because that's one thing in 70 years. And as we see in Dege, Tibetans have never stopped resisting and fighting China's occupation of our lands. And whatever language they use, they've just gotten better at using the language of development and poverty alleviation and trying to make everything seem sort of okay, well packaged in a PR sense for the world, while in reality on the ground, their practices, their methods, their control, their repression, the brutality is worse. It's ramped up. It's more, the strategies are more insidious, and we can see that also in the resource extraction projects across Tibet, and in the way that they've sort of made it okay to get foreign investment in these projects and international technologies and expertise. And people just think it's another part of the world that's being developed, many, while we know it's something that's forced upon Tibetans, and Tibetans do not have, in any sense of the word, any way to have free, prior, and informed consent over any of these project strategies. Education's part of it, that China is forcing on them.
Thanks, Ladala. It's just heartbreaking when we look at Tibet, and it's not just what's happening in Dagen, but what's happening with the land and the environment and the culture. But it's also, like you spoke about, the children. When you take away little kids aged 4 years old and remove them, they never learn these ways of. They never learn their language. They never learn the culture. They never learn their heritage, and all of this grasslands and all of the Tibetan Plateau has been preserved by generations of Tibetans, and this knowledge is passed down. But that's where it breaks because the children are taken away. This is something that has been protested by so many people, and I wanted to talk to Pasang about this because I know Pasang, you've been working on it for a while. Can you talk a little bit about the environmental defenders in Tibet who put everything on the line time and again to protest these mega development projects, from dams to poaching to illegal mining?
Unmute. Okay. Thank you so much, Rashi, for the warm introduction. So when we were going through this session, I was just reminded of a time when I was kid in school, and our drawing teacher will often ask us to draw the picture of your homeland, what your country looks like, and we will always draw a snowy mountain and then flowing rivers, the pastures, herd of yaks and sheep, a peaceful homeland that looks like to me. And but now, over the past 2 decades, China's relentless development policies that they say has drastically transformed the landscape of Tibet, a peaceful scene, into a landscape of mining operation, the infrastructure, energy project, with all those extraction projects, right? And while the world has turned the blind eyes to the fragile Tibet environment, it is those Tibetan environmental defenders who are paying the price. These brave individuals is only trying to protect their own land and culture, but they were stripped out of their basic human rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of expression or movement, and their legitimate concern was often dismissed, and but also they were often labeled as an act of separatism or sharing state secrets. So personally for me, this concern is deep, very, very deep personal for me, because my ancestors has a deep connection with land. My grandfather was a nomad, and my father has also followed his footsteps. He's still a nomad. And they didn't need a modern tools to understand the world around them. They could easily predict the upcoming weather, even the time or the seasons, or when to plant the next crop by simply observing the land and animal movement around them. And from the herd of like 500 sheep, my father could point out which is which sheep and what is his character and everything and else. And so this profound connection with land has been passed down through generation, which defined us as a Tibetan. And now this connection is also under threat. Let's as we talk about environmental defender, let's take a tragic case of Gonjo Chimba. He was a tour guide by profession, but he's an environmental defender by heart. And in February 2021, after serving 8 years in prison of his 21 years imprisonment sentence, only for sharing information about the protest that was happening in Diru County in Tibet, and he died in a custody. Even before his arrest, he briefly posted on a WeChat where he says, "I'm at the bank of river and I know they're going to arrest me. And even if they arrest me, I'm not afraid. And even if they killed me, I have no regrets." So, but the Kunjo Chimba story is not a unique one, unfortunately. Many Tibetans have tried to resist or raise alarm about the threats this extraction project is poses on their environment through different means, through protest or through writing a blogs or sharing the information to the outside world or other nonviolent activities. And these environmental defenders are often silenced or imprisoned or even killed for just trying to protect our own land. So for generation, Tibetan like my father and my grandfather has lived in harmony with our land, with our pastures, mountains, rivers, trying to protect it for the future generation. But in contrast, these occupying Chinese government is attaching a financial value to all of financial value to everything, to our mountains, to water, to minerals. And as Tembala said before, these colonial people government has no hesitation to ripping off the world and ripping off the earth and displacing whole community just to harness these minerals and to exploit them. So I really believe that this situation has a far-reaching consequences, and it is the Tibetan plateau is critical not only for Tibetan but also for the nearly 40% of the world's population who is relying on the uh, Tibet ecosystem services, right? And Tibetan have been standing up against this injustice and challenging China's rampant destruction on our land for decades. And their wisdom, rooted in deep ancestral connection to the earth, is really, really essential to tackle the global climate crisis. So I believe that world can no longer afford to ignore Tibet. Thank you.
Thanks, Pasang. I don't think the world should be ignoring Tibet. And in some cases, we've heard there have been sort of statements that have been passed recently about environmental defenders. Can you talk about what other high-profile environmental defender cases have been raised internationally?
Um, so recently, the International Campaigns for Tibet has released a report where the 50 Tibetan environmental defenders were surveyed, and among whom the 29 individuals were serving the prison sentence as we speak now. And while I was going through a report or assessing a report, they say that assessing their environmental concern, 26 were protesting against the mining industry and or against the poaching of the endangered species, or and 21 were against the land appropriation of the various industry, including the bricks or the meat manufacturing industry. And also like to mention that recently UN Human Rights Special Reporter or UN Human Rights Specialist has raised an a statement where they raised a case of 9 Tibetan environmental defenders who was imprisoned between 2010 to 2019 and who were all again detained uh, after a while they either protested against illegal mining that was happening in Tibet or the poaching of the endangered species. And then if I would like to also mention those 9 Tibetan who are identified to be released are Anya Senda, Doje Takal, Kesang Choklang, Tongye Vinchen Namju, Suljum Gombo, Changjung Utup, Sogdo Abu, or Namse, and these 9 people. And we welcome the statement that was issued by this UN right experts, because this highlight the need of the global attention to take a stronger action to support Tibet, and also they were to be given the right to even to freely participate in the decision affecting their land. There need to be a moratorium on those mega development projects like minings and dam project, where until the time where these Tibetans have right and freedom to participate in decision making. They should be part of the conversation, and they should be part of the solution too. Yes.
Awesome. I don't think anybody could have said it better. They need to be part of the solution. And as we said in the beginning, like Tibetans need a seat at the table. They know their land better than anybody else. I know, Zoe, I want to come to you now because you have been particularly looking into how Western companies have been complicit in the occupation of Tibet. Do you think that's something that could be said, like the West is complicit in the occupation of Tibet?
Absolutely. The West has been complicit in the occupation of Tibet, partnering with China for mutual enrichment for decades in trade while Tibet's been occupied, and the natural resources have been plundered. Unique environment has been altered permanently. Since the opening of diplomatic relations with the West in the 1970s, China has risen to the status of most favored trading nation with many countries around the world. The Chinese name for Tibet, Xinjiang, literally translates to the Western Treasure House, and the decades of China's occupation have made it clear that China intends to strip Tibet of non-renewable resources and control Tibet's water supply. China's occupation of Tibet, has gone unchallenged by global powers, and in fact, countries like Australia, the US, UK, Canada, and more have ensured that their wealth and the wealth of China has grown together over the decades of occupation. In contrast, Tibetans continue to have their sovereignty and human rights violated. Mining and mega development projects permanently changed the landscape of Tibet, and Tibet has only been occupied since 1950, so 74 years seems like a long time, and it is a long occupation. But when we're talking about the permanent and irreparable damage of Tibet's landscape, which has been destroyed without the free consent of Tibetan people, an occupying power should be seen as a temporary impediment by the very nature of history. Tibet was an independent country before, and obviously we're hoping that Tibet will be and working towards Tibet being a free country in the future. And so China should not be allowed to make decisions while occupying Tibet that will have a permanent effect on that land. Investment should rely on obtaining free consent of people in order to satisfy any claims of corporate social responsibility. Corporations have a responsibility not just to profit and for economic consequences of their activities, but for the social and environmental consequences as well. Any company that's profiting from mining or mega development projects in Tibet is operating in a risky environment, both reputational risk and the failure to comply with their own CSR policies. A moratorium would demand that it is Tibetans who should be the ones to decide about the permanent environmental changes and the non-renewable resources and their use. In the future, Tibetans may return to a state of independence or, under the Dalai Lama's middle way approach, genuine autonomy. And at that time, Tibetans may decide that they're willing to provide consent to mining and mega development projects. But it cannot be that the occupying power of China makes those decisions while Tibetans are not free to provide any consent, or, as we know, if they do protest or try to withdraw their consent in any way, they're arrested, they're tortured, and, with dire consequences, as Pasang has just explained. The Tibet movement has a history of taking on companies with failed ethics regarding Tibet, such as Sino Gold, which is an Australian gold mining company, Google, Apple, BP, most recently Thermo Fisher, of course. And this campaign will have opportunities, I think, to challenge companies investing in Chinese hydropower projects, lithium mining, and other projects, and challenge those companies that have put profits above the rights and sovereignty of Tibetans. As we said, a moratorium would demand that the decisions about Tibetan natural resources be made by Tibetans, and China's occupation currently is robbing Tibetans of their future wealth once the occupation of Tibet is ended. This is an issue of the self-determination of Tibetan people and the sovereignty over national wealth and resources. But like moratoriums, or this idea of a moratorium is a peace strategy. In a similar way to boycott or divestment campaigns, it's an activist strategy. And it's designed to cut off China's ability to profit from Tibet and transfer the power back to the Tibetan movement and Tibetan people and force China back to the negotiation table with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That's the goal, really, to get the decision-making power back in the hands of Tibetan people.
Thanks, Zoe. One of the arguments that these companies, especially the ones in the West that are investing with China, make is green energy. Because, like lithium mining would sponsor electric vehicles, hydropower when it comes to Gantok Dam, all of these arguments that are being made about green energy. And that's the biggest that's their stand on mega development when you talk about Western complicity. Do you think it's really green energy, or can it be even called green energy when Tibet is an occupied nation? I mean, isn't it something similar to blood diamonds?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive ethical dilemma for the green energy transition, and it needs to be confronted. I feel that people who care about the environment, the climate, and the future of the planet shouldn't shy away from these deeper ethical questions about the ethics of mining on occupied land and extracting non-renewable resources like lithium, or the ethics of a hydropower dam that will permanently flood a Tibetan village and destroy houses and centuries-old monasteries in its wake. China is seeking to capitalize on the green energy transition and continue to rob Tibetans of their natural resources. And Western countries are eager to invest in things like lithium, as you said, which is found in Tibet, and other non-renewable resources. And their actions embolden China and leave China unchallenged, and like we said before, they're complicit in that they allow their own growth, their economic growth, and China's growth to go side by side, while it is robbing Tibetans of their rights to their own future and also to their current environment in their rivers and natural resources. Tibetans aren't able to consent to mines and dams in their land and, as we've said, have been arrested for protesting. So this is the green energy transition's ethical dilemma. It's about the ownership of the mineral resources needed for that transition, and also what to do when these resources are in the hands of occupying forces. It's really just a question of, who has the right to decide, who can profit from these natural resources and these projects, and is that something that the West in any way wants to support? It's an ethical dilemma, like I said, that needs to be confronted, and we shouldn't be shying away from it.
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, I agree. I kind of wanted to bring up a question about just resistance in Tibet and how it's succeeded. And that's a question that I'm leaving up to the panel of experts here right now. Would any of you would like to answer that? How resistance in Tibet has succeeded time and again?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Google, like a company, drop their Project Dragonfly. We've seen BP sell off controversial PetroChina shares that were involved in Tibet. We've seen, the Liverpool Football Club end their controversial deal with Tibet Water. And, as we said before, Thermo Fisher ended all sales of the DNA kits to Tibet. I mean, the Tibet movement has got runs on the board here with these kinds of campaigns that target companies. And I think any company that is investing in hydro dams, lithium, or other mining projects in Tibet should be feeling very worried that now our attention is going to be turning onto them, because the history of the Tibet movement is that when we take on these projects, we do win.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think people need to remember, that the Thermo Fisher win just came very recently. Like, it was in January this year that we had Thermo Fisher dropping these things, and it happened in your home city, Latinla, in Boston, where people went, like Tibetans went after this $1 billion company and got them to drop selling kits in Tibet. What do you have to add on to the resistance of Tibetans, not just in Tibet, but also in exile, and the continuous just perseverance that Tibetans bring?
Yeah, I think it's so important for us to know our history sort of as a people, as a movement, and to, I think, inspire the international community with this story, really, that is one of against all odds. Tibetans inside Tibet have consistently come out and fought back, mostly, almost entirely, completely nonviolently, even in these recent decades, against Chinese repression and especially exploitation or attempted exploitation of Tibetan lands. And I think to my time within the first year, within the first month of working as Students for a Free Tibet in 1999, Tibetans inside Tibet alerted the international community to a proposed World Bank project that was essentially going to be the World Bank, so international nations, funding population transfer of mostly Han Chinese settlers into Tibet and onto Tibetan land. And they said it was going to be a death sentence for them. Letters were smuggled out from the local people who had, of course, no say in what was about to happen to them. And it was already a poor area with scarce resources. And, you know, I think of that moment where this beautiful teamwork sort of came so clearly, became obvious to the world, because Tibetans inside took the first, made the first move and called for help and raised the alarm. And then we on the outside took our cue from them. And I think ICT, International Campaign for Tibet, submitted immediately like a procedural sort of petition to the World Bank saying, you can't do this. This is essentially funding population transfer, China's genocidal project in Tibet. And at the same time, Tibetans inside have said no, and the bank is supposed to have safeguards and, policies and procedures to protect local people. And it triggered this, not just a global campaign of Tibetans and Tibet support groups and the Tibetan government in exile, everybody working together to stop this project. But it was such an important signal to Tibetans inside Tibet that, whatever we could do, we would do to respond to their call to action. And at the same time, it signaled to the international community and to China, the World Bank's biggest borrower, so best customer, that that Tibet was not just going to be some easy place to go steamroll, and to exploit, and to China wasn't going to just have we weren't just going to let China have a free pass to do whatever they wanted in Tibet. Even if we can't go in, Tibetans can't get out. We were going to find other ways in a truly strategic, nonviolent, and creative way to battle them. And that campaign, by 2000 July, there had been such a ruckus and so many protests, and Students for Free Tibet doing direct action, and the global Tibet movement, everybody contacting their nation, representatives on the bank, that they didn't go ahead with it. And they essentially, the World Bank's board of directors who have to approve the project, there was an investigation and a lot of things happened. But in the end, it did not go forward. It got huge attention. We were told originally it was impossible to stop the bank, because when the bank wanted something and when the World Bank executives leadership wanted something, and President James Wolfenson at the time, he wanted this to go forward. So China wants it. The most powerful actors in the bank want it. Sorry, guys, this is so sad. It's going to be impossible, is what many people told us. And we did it. And that was the beginning of this whole Great Western Development Strategy that Jiang Zemin launched, and that Xi Jinping has continued on with this Belt and Road Initiative. And Tibet was kind of this symbolic core, in a way, of that. And I think there we saw how the resistance can be successful, the key role the Tibetans inside play in it and have agency, even in these terrible circumstances, and the critical importance of our role on the outside. And all I will say is that in closing, we had an opportunity then as the mining and everything started happening in Tibet. And there was a successful Sino Gold campaign from Australia. We really had momentum, and there were voices in the Tibet movement and in the world who tried to derail us, and they sort of successfully did. People who sort of said, well, we can't just, we sound like we're backwards if we go against all extraction projects in Tibet or all so-called development in Tibet. Maybe we should just allow some of these projects to go through and not fight them all, because Western corporations, it's better that they're in there helping carry these projects out. And then we can have a say here in what they do. And that felt really wrong to a lot of us. But unfortunately, we didn't launch a moratorium all those years ago. And I just want to point out we should have. And a lot of us felt we needed to, but we didn't have we really need unity in the movement to get things done a lot of the time. And so all this idea that Western corporation involvement in Tibet is going to be helpful just because they hand out a few maybe technical education opportunities symbolically to Tibetans doesn't give us any right to say that these projects can go ahead. Until Tibetans inside Tibet can say that, until Tibetans are free to say what they want, it's not up to us to say, yeah, maybe this is a good project. Maybe it should go ahead. Maybe it's better than nothing if Tibetans get some scraps from the table. I just think that totally morally, ethically wrong. And I think this moratorium is long overdue. And I thank Tibet Network and others for really working on it to get it off the ground. And I hope the international community and, all of our international Tibet Network members and supporters and the wider Tibet movement will get behind it, because I think, it's really one of the best strategies we can have moving forward, just to say, until Tibet is free, until Tibetans have their rights and freedom, don't touch Tibet. And if you do, there'll be a cost and it'll be a battle. And that's just the very least I feel like we can do.
Thank you, Ladala. I mean, I think I don't need to say this, but it's such a clear step to me and it's so obvious, like, why are these Western companies, why are these countries even investing in occupied country? Like, it's just so bizarre that you could have CSR policies and you could shout yourself as, oh, look at us, we're a billion-dollar company, we're making millions, and we're doing all of this good work, and we have all of these like corporate social responsibility schemes, and yet you go and you work with China and you try to greenwash their crimes of occupation. I think it really does set us up for our next set of experts that I wanted to bring on to talk about the moratorium. Thank you so much, Zoe, Ladin, and Pasang, for being here today and for talking about this. The concept of a moratorium, as we saw in the very beginning, we have had a call from the movement about a moratorium on mega development in Tibet. That until the time Tibetans in Tibet can decide what to do with their land, no other person, no other country, no other company should have the right to decide. And this brings me to how moratorium is the next step forward. And I'd like to invite our final three experts. Shonda Gupta is a campaigner working for social justice and liberation. She's based in the UK as the freelance campaigner on issues of human rights, justice, and liberation. She's previously worked with Runnymeds, Greenpeace UK, and ECHO, which was formerly known as Some of Us. She's been a spokesperson for various campaigns, including one that targeted Apple's censorship in regions of Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong. Last year, she coordinated successful shareholder action against Thermo Fisher under the Hands Off Tibetan DNA campaign. I would also like to add that Chonda was instrumental in that victory. I would like to now invite a second guest, John Jones, who's the head of campaigns and policy and research at Free Tibet, where he has worked since 2015. During this time, he has worked in close partnership with the Tibetan movement on numerous corporate and environmental campaigns. And last but not the least, we want to invite the very dynamic Shamila Mo. She's a Tibetan Canadian human rights activist and currently serves as the campaign director at Students for a Free Tibet and is on the leadership council of the World Liberty Congress. Thank you all for being here. And to start off where Zoe left off and where Ladina left off, Shonda, since you researched into these companies who are complicit in the occupation of Tibet, and really use their greenwashing techniques to kind of just dilly-dally around it. Can you speak a little bit about the concept of a moratorium on Chinese and mega development and what its significance is, and also, most importantly, what it would look like?
Thank you, Rashi, and thank you for inviting me to take part today. It's always such a privilege to be in this esteemed company. So to build on what other speakers have said, the foundational principle of our call for a moratorium on mega development in Tibet is that under occupation, Tibetans are simply not able to give free, informed and prior consent or refusal to such projects, nor are they able to benefit from this mineral and geological wealth for their own ends. The mega developments are being forced on Tibetan people by the Chinese state, and as we've heard from other panelists, forced on them violently and in ways that damage the ecology of their lands. The Chinese state is then enriching itself through this colonial repression, as are any international companies working alongside it. And while it is mostly Chinese state enterprises that are involved in these particular ventures, we know all too well that international companies are itching to continue profiting from the mineral wealth, the labor and market that China offers, and so that international players also vying for access. And these corporations often structure themselves in an ostensibly hands-off way to distance decision-making from their Western headquarters, or provide plausible deniability through spun-off entities, sometimes forming joint ventures with Chinese companies and so on. But this really is just the usual corporate games, the kind of smoke and mirror tactics to allow them to present a face of caring capitalism over here to their Western consumers and their shareholders, and claim to be in line with environmental social governance commitments, CSR policies, and the UN guiding principles on human rights. But it's pretty clear that any voluntary initiatives are at best too slow, and I'm being pretty generous here, to tackle the challenges of our times: climate breakdown, biodiversity collapse, human rights abuses. And at worst, are just box-ticking, window-dressing exercises that have no tangible real-world impact whatsoever. Sure, the better players might quit markets, but into that vacuum will enter more unscrupulous actors that we are less able to influence, and the harm continues. So the only answer to all of these challenges is really regulation, and regulation with teeth that compels corporations to act. And in the case of Tibet, in this instance, we need a moratorium that simply halts and prevents any further resource extraction and development until such time that the Tibetan people can freely, to their own ends and with appropriate ecological stewardship, decide how to proceed.
Thanks, Shonda. I know that this is a campaign that has been building and gaining momentum for a while now, and we've been doing critical research into it. John, you've been you've been one of those key people who have been brainstorming this particular campaign. Can you talk about just hands off Tibet's land? What is this campaign? What does it aim to achieve? And how we're going to do it?
Sure. So, hands off Tibet's land and the demand for a moratorium on extraction across Tibet, which has been issued by Tibetans around the world, has the potential to be one of the pivotal moments in the Tibetan freedom struggle. For over a decade, Tibet groups, by working together, have won a string of corporate campaigns, forcing some of the companies that Zoe listed earlier, like BP, and Liverpool and Google and Thermo Fisher Scientific, massive names, to stop exploiting Tibet. These are all victories. They made a real difference. They all put a spotlight on Tibet for media and policymakers and the public at a time when it often feels like Tibet is being hidden from public view as a result of direct Chinese government policy. So this latest intervention from Tibetans across the Tibet movement builds on this work. It's a message to all corporations and governments involved in the digging of mines, the building of dams, the supply of equipment that represses Tibetans. It confronts them with the reality of how Tibetans feel when they're free to speak out and the effects the exploitation has on them. It makes it clear that these corporate campaigns are not a series of solitary victories, but they're connected, and that the story does not end with any one corporate campaign victory. We go on. And it sets a precedent that other international companies must follow, which touches on something that Laden said earlier, which is that their complicity in the exploitation of Tibet, which is a country as closed off from the world as North Korea, that complicity would not fly under the radar. It would turn into a very public battle. So this call for a moratorium will be built into our government advocacy, our media outreach, our approaches to corporations exploiting Tibet, so that with each corporate campaign and each victory, the demand for a moratorium becomes louder, more established, more familiar to governments, policymakers, and journalists. It becomes woven into the fabric of the Tibetan struggle. It becomes something that journalists will remember to put in their articles. So this line has been drawn, and the next challenge to those exploiting Tibet has in fact already begun. As we discussed earlier, it's been 6 months since the February protests against the Kamtok Dam in Doki County, and the giant state-owned company behind the dam, China Huadian, has international partners and investors whom we've already contacted, explaining why their relationships and investments are toxic, how China Huadian's dam will see villages and monasteries destroyed by flooding and see lives ruined. And so the plan is to next week build on this work that we're discussing here today and launch the online campaign targeting several of the companies who we've identified, backed up with advocacy efforts, information on social media, and outreach to journalists. And it's an appeal to all the Tibetan groups that might be watching this, that with every Tibet group that gets involved in this campaign, even at the most micro level, they will make the campaign bigger, and they'll increase the chances of it successfully meeting its objectives. Thanks.
Thanks, John. A lot of what you said and a lot of what we do in the Tibetan movement requires just critical backing from supporters. Shimi, that's something that's like right up your alley. Why do you think supporter action would have a deep impact on the success of any campaign, especially this one?
Because the power lies in the people. It's pretty simple. But getting the buy-in of everyone watching and all of the supporters is not always easy. And so I want to encourage you all to think and just imagine for a second that you've been living in your house in your neighborhood for thousands of years. Due to the occupation, you lose touch with your cousins and your families who made the extraneous trip to the land of where His Holiness the Dalai Lama now resides. But your family stayed, and life continued under occupation. Slowly, you notice that they start teaching Chinese instead of Tibetan in your schools. Your children are no longer speaking your own mother tongue. Life is much harder, but still, it continued. Life continued, and you found other ways to preserve and resist. Then one day you get a notice that you're being forcefully evicted and relocated because the rumor is that they're building dams. The home where you and your family have lived for thousands of years. Where will you and your family go? The village heads make pleas to stop the dams, but they get arrested, beaten, and enforcement officials come door to door checking. You soon find out that your life is just one of the thousands of lives that are going to be uprooted. The lands are going to be transformed so that China can have its ambitious goals to build hydropower projects to power Eastern China and profit from your lands. As you know, this is happening in real time. And just 6 months ago, we got a glimpse of the uprisings of the people inside of Dege during the Dege protests. If we, the people in the international community, don't jump into action in solidarity with the people inside of Tibet, we will see several ancient, culturally important Tibetan Buddhist monasteries like the Wonto Gompa, the Ato Gompa, destroyed. We'll see a number of villages submerged, displacing thousands and thousands of Tibetans whose livelihoods have flourished alongside the rivers for generations. So while China's exploitation of the Tibetan environment accelerates, Tibet continues to be one of the most vital yet invisibilized frontline communities. It's home to the largest freshwater outside of the polar regions and one of the epicenters of global climate change. So tell me, how can there be climate justice without a free Tibet? It's time. We've showed up in the previous campaigns. We, as the international community, have gone into action and we have seen results. As folks have shared, we have celebrated our victories, but it's time again for us to jump into action. Go to tibetanmoratorium.org. We'll soon be launching a petition. Take action. We want you to watch this video and share this video. Share the other videos that we've shared along. We want the whole international community to send a strong message, not just to the Chinese government, but the international world, that there is a cost for operating inside of occupied Tibet, and that there is no climate justice or human rights without a free Tibet.
Thanks, Jimmy. I mean, we've been saying this for years that Tibet is at the front line of climate crisis. And I think you said this, you now and, Pasang before and Ladin and Lobsang and Tempa, everybody has spoken about what's at stake in Tibet. Yet we have these companies moving in. John, I want to come back to you, what you were talking about, that you've been in touch with some companies. Do we know what companies are involved, and if so, how are they complicit?
Sure. So the main company behind the Cantal Dam is a giant Chinese, largely state-owned company called China Huadian. China Huadian has some international investors and companies that have gone into partnership with it. So to give the example of two of the investors that we've been looking into, there's Credit Agricole in France and another group called Schroders in the UK. They both have some investments in China Huadian, which gives us a very precise, targeted objective for this campaign. And there is a third company that I think is a bit more familiar to everyone in the audience, which is the giant German company Siemens Energy, which earlier this year signed a cooperation agreement with China Huadian. And they are a giant, newsworthy target that give us someone to campaign after and convince them to end their relationship with China Huadian. But there will also be, hopefully, some media coverage accompanying that as well. So in the coming week, we're going to be directing supporters and friends across the Tibet movement to a series of petitions targeting those companies. We have already reached out to each of them on the basis that maybe initially they were ignorant about what their investments were doing, the fact that their investments to some extent involved Tibetan suffering. They now have all the information that they need to make the right decision. So the next stage of the campaign is to publicly name and shame them and to get the wider public on board, as well as people in governments, in media, anyone who has a bit of leverage over these companies, just to convince them to do the right thing, to make them understand that going into business with a company like China Huadian will carry a financial and reputational cost. And that, our precedent has shown with corporate campaigns, whether it's Google or Liverpool FC or Thermo Fisher Scientific, that no company is too big to stop us winning a campaign.
Thanks, John. Rightly said. I mean, I don't think, I think just proof is in the pudding. We've seen that with Thermo Fisher, we've seen that with BB, we've seen that with Liverpool Football Club, we've seen that with World Bank. Just absolutely no company is too big, and there is absolutely no excuse for what they're doing. Want to come to you now, Shonda, since you're the corporate campaigns expert. Why would companies like Siemens Energy, Credit Agricole, and Schroders pull out of China? Why would they do that? And the second part of that question is, how can we build global momentum around the moratorium for projects, for mega development projects in Tibet?
Thank you. So yes, I mean, I think firstly, it's important not to lose sight of the end goal here. We target companies, sure, but we want the government of China to cease and desist committing human rights abuses. We don't want simply for companies to pull out and that be the end of the story. But we do want the companies to end their complicity. And by losing the halo effect or that social license to operate that the government of China gets and is conferred by doing business with international corporations, legitimizing the CCP's actions does help us move towards that goal by essentially shifting the power balance somehow. Not shifting the power balance. But I'm not going to pretend that getting companies to pull out of China, essentially giving up profits, will be easy. But with sustained pressure and a multi-pronged approach, it should be possible. Companies will take such a decision based on crossing a tipping point where the challenges, both regulatory and reputational, are greater than the reward. And that's where we have some control of the situation. We need to and can leverage all the tools that we have, pushing for regulation from individual, regional, and international governmental bodies, consumer and shareholder action, and so on in a sort of multi-headed campaigning network. And we do know that the regulation of corporate activities does have impact. To take a different but not unrelated example, we've seen with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, a beginning of a change to cotton markets as companies diversify their cotton supplies away from the Uyghur region. So we need to continue chipping away at that legitimacy of profiting from China while that state engages in such egregious human rights abuses using every approach we have. And as the quote most often attributed to Desmond Tutu goes, the only way to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. And how do we do that? How do we continue taking those bites? Well, it's a huge question, but the kernel of it is that we need to grow a network, an alliance, an assemblage of all sorts of people and devise actions led by Tibetans and impacted communities, of course, as Ladan and others have spoken so eloquently on. And devise those actions that they can take in their own sphere to raise awareness of the situation and to move their sphere to supporting the solution, which is a moratorium in this instance. Everybody can take effective action, but what the most effective action is for someone to take can vary if they're a consumer, a shareholder, an employee, or so on. So we need to be smart here. And we know we can have impact, as others have mentioned. Look at our campaigns against Google, against Apple, against Thermo Fisher Scientific in recent years. And we must keep reminding people of those successes and the power that they do hold. And for this campaign, we'd be scaling up those tools and tactics, those things that we've used so successfully in the past, and doing so in a sustained and sustainable way that builds and maintains momentum for a moratorium.
Thanks, Shonda. I think I want to sum this up, and to me, you would be the perfect person to do this. If you could ask people to do two things today, just two supporter actions, what would they be?
For sure. I want to remind people for a second that during the Thermo Fisher campaign, we had over 80,000 petition signatures. We had protests in so many cities across the world, with Thermo Fisher offices having Tibetan and Tibet supporter protests happening. We had social media campaigns going, which they did not know how to handle. And quite seriously, they just fumbled upon when we had multiple people commenting on their social media pages saying that they were aiding and abetting a genocide. So similarly, they do not know what's coming for them. Folks, let's jump into action. Two things you could do is watch this video and share. And secondly, most importantly, go to tibetmoratorium.org to learn more.
Thanks, Jimmy. I couldn't have said this better. Thank you to all the experts for being here today and for everyone who's been watching this stream. Today's discussion has shed this critical light on the urgent situation in Tibet, where the Tibetan environment, culture, and human rights are under an unprecedented threat. But also, we have glimpsed a better future, one where Tibetans have a say in their own development, where human rights and environmental protection are prioritized, and where international solidarity makes a difference. We will close out today with a video that we saw at the very beginning of Tibetans calling for a moratorium, calling for a halt on mega development in occupied Tibet. Find out more, tibetmoratorium.org. Thank you and good luck and free Tibet.
We are Tibetans.
Our country, Tibet, was invaded by China in 1950.
For over 70 years, China has run roughshod over the rights of the Tibetan people, our people.
Our land has been stolen, our lives systematically eradicated.
Before the occupation, Tibetans stewarded the land with care and concern, preserving the pastures, rivers, and mountains.
But today, under China's military occupation, Tibet and its unique and important environment are suffering the consequences of failed policies, greed, and exploitation.
Gigantic unregulated mines tear through Tibet's landscape.
Mega hydropower stations choke major Tibetan rivers, vital rivers that supply fresh water to over 1 billion people.
Our villages flooded, our cultural heritage destroyed, and all without any consultation with local Tibetans.
China's exploitation of Tibet is causing mass pollution, destroying vital ecosystems, and defacing Tibet's once pristine landscape.
Our land,
Our lives
Our livelihoods
are being destroyed.
And international companies are complicit in the exploitation and destruction of Tibet.
Now we are taking a stand.
We Tibetans from around the world are calling for a global moratorium on resource extraction and mega development in Tibet.
Until Tibetans are able to determine how our land and resources are used, all extraction of Tibet's natural resources must halt.
Those who profit from Tibet's resource exploitation are complicit in the occupation and repression of the Tibetan people, as well as the destruction of our lands.
We call on international companies
and international governments
to listen to our words
and support our cause.